Hello, my name is Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space. I want to, on behalf of the initiative and all of our panelists, thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for what we hope will be a interesting and useful conversation. Humanity in Deep Space emerged really this conversation about a year and a half ago when we started talking about deep space and the fact that we are a spacefaring civilization and that it's not something in the future, it's actually something that's happening. And I think we all agree as well that we're probably closer now in our civilization in the world to actually putting humans on Mars than we've ever been. Now, whether that's 5 years from now, 3 years, 20 years, we don't know. But I think with all of the tremendous progress among various countries and companies that are going on, certainly what's just happened this week with Perseverance and the other countries that have put rovers on Mars, and just the acceleration of a lot of the technology and what's happening, that we are in fact moving very, very close at some point, relatively speaking, to putting people on Mars. Of course, with robots on Mars, in a sense, we're already there. Those are simply an extension of us as humans. And so Humanity in Deep Space, really, this conversation grew out of on a recognition that being successful into moving into deep space, moving out of low Earth orbit, even moving beyond the moon, is fraught with a lot of technological and scientific difficulties. But there's a lot of other issues that are also very much involved, very human issues about us as people and how are we going to do this, and can we do this in a way that is sustainable, where we can thrive, where we maintain our humanity. And so as you get into those other things, you start to get into all sorts of interesting questions about human psychology, physiology, food, what are we going to eat, the role of virtual reality, the ethics, planetary ethics, all sorts of things that are really part of this challenge that we face as humans. And so before we get into the discussion, it's going to be, again, it's going to be an open discussion, very much like a dinner conversation. You'll be able to ask questions. We're going to reserve probably the last 15 minutes to actually to get to the questions, but I encourage you to go ahead and do that. And so, but before we start, I'd like to bring up our sponsors and thank them for their support of this whole effort and what we're doing. Those are the sponsors. I'm not going to read them. You can read them yourself, but all of those sponsors were instrumental in making this possible. They also were instrumental in helping us spread the word. And so, again, very, very appreciative of all the sponsors. Okay, and let me just also say, in terms of welcoming everybody, we have over 450 people who have registered for this event. And let's see, we're getting back and forth here. Hold on. There we go. We have over 450 people who have registered for the event from over 40 countries. And that's more than we expected. And we're very excited about that. And one reason we're excited about it is because of the diversity of countries. I think we should recognize that moving into deep space, going to places like Mars and elsewhere, this is a planetary challenge. This is a planetary issue. And it's important that we remember that. It's not the purview of a company or a couple of companies or a country or a couple of countries. This really has to be, if we're going to be successful and we're going to do it right, it has to be a planetary effort. And so we're very pleased that we have this kind of participation. And also, if you ask a question when you identify yourself, if you can, also you might identify where you're from, not just to give us a sense of the flavor of where we're from. So let's get into the conversation. What we want to start with, let me ask the panel. Let me ask everybody. Everybody to give me a one-liner of your how you would introduce yourself. Their bios are on the page, but go ahead. Start with Savannah.
Sure. It's great to be here, Chris. I'm excited that all of you have come to check out this webinar. It's going to be a real treat. My name is Savannah Mundell. I am currently a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech in Science and Technology Studies, but I am first and foremost an anthropologist who studies outer space.
Great. Serena?
Hi, I'm Serena Reza. I'm the CEO of Mission Space Food. At Mission Space Food, we are the first commercial company pairing delicious food with countermeasures, nutritional countermeasures, to enable astronauts not just to survive deep space missions, but actually to thrive.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, my name is Greg Schmidt. I'm a 36-year NASA veteran, and I'm director of NASA's Survey Institute, where human exploration meets science.
Great. Matt?
Hey, Chris, great to be back with you again. I am Matt Kaplan, the host and producer of Planetary Radio for the last 18 and a half years at the Planetary Society. And we are very happy to be part of this. I bring you greetings from our boss, CEO Bill Nye.
Thanks. Scott?
Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Solomon. I'm an associate teaching professor of biology at Rice University, and I'm an evolutionary biologist who thinks about how moving into deep space might trigger evolutionary changes in humans and other species we bring with us.
Dean?
Hello, everyone. My name is Dean Rader. I'm a poet and an essayist, and I'm a professor in the Department of English and the Honors College at the University of San Francisco.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So to start off with, oh, I'm sorry. I'm Tiffany. I'm sorry. I missed you. I apologize.
I'm easy to miss.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tiffany Bora. I'm a molecular biologist by training. Right now, I'm working on the intersection of humanity and technology. So I do that as the vice chair of digital biology and medicine at Singularity University, as a fellow at the Geotech Center for the Atlantic Council, and as a member of the Homeward Bound project working on women leadership in STEM.
And I'm Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space, and also a co-founder of the Space Tango, which is an emerging space company that does work R&D and manufacturing in space on the International Space Station. So let's start out by just saying, one of the things we talk about going to Mars is if it's our inevitable destiny, and that may be. But what do you think? What do you think are the most compelling reasons to you, or the compelling reason to take this step and to actually try to put humans on Mars? Tiffany, you want to start us out?
Sure, I can answer that from both a personal perspective and from a biology perspective. So as a biologist, I feel like there is no more important question than, is there life elsewhere in the universe, or are we it? And to my mind, the closest place to home to look for that is Mars. So that's why as a biologist, I'm really excited. But as a person, I grew up in Florida. I used to watch space launches from my backyard as a kid. I've been on 3 Mars simulations in the high Canadian Arctic and in the southeastern Utah desert. And man, there is just something about space exploration that I think brings out the best in our species. And especially today, when we're being beset by all kinds of uncertainty and conflict and political nonsense, I really see this as a unifying endeavor for our species, where we can be our most smart, our most collaborative, our most creative, and do it all together to do something amazing. That's what it's about for me.
Terrific. Who else wants to chime in next? Serena, go ahead.
Sure. I second everything Tiffany said, of course. But I think for me, the first and foremost reason why I think we should explore extraterrestrial bodies and outer space in general, whether that be Mars or a moon of Jupiter or Saturn, is because of what it will teach us about our home planet and about harnessing the extreme environments on our home planet that have yet to really be utilized to their fullest. And that can mean the depths of the ocean sea, that can mean the Arctic, that can mean extreme environments in the desert, whether that's South American deserts or Central American deserts or deserts in Africa. These are all places that have yet to be used to their fullest and really need to be taken advantage of more before, and what we can learn that from space travel.
Dean, as a poet, and we see from your cello in the background, cello player, although we understand he doesn't play very well, what's your perspective? What kind of perspective do you come for this?
Well, as a writer and someone who's interested in language and exploring and expanding our notion of language, I'm very curious about what space exploration might do for us in terms of how we articulate what Savannah was talking about as well, our relationship to our planet, but also to ourselves. The great German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein has this fascinating quote where he says, "The borders of my language mean the borders of my world." And I'm interested in inverting that. And what if we ask, the borders of my world mean the borders of my language? And so what if our notion of our world or universe expands? So too might our notion of language expand and maybe help us as a species articulate our relationship to ourselves and our planet and each other in more interesting and inclusive ways.
Okay. Let me ask Matt. Matt is probably the guru of space. I mean, I can't imagine how many people Matt has interviewed as part of planetary radio, but the great thing is he interviews a great diversity of people from all different backgrounds. So synthesizing what your own personal thought with what you've been talking to people about for forever, what's your take on this?
I am so in step with what we've already heard from, these other great panelists, because that's what compels me. I mean, it's what our boss, Bill Nye, calls the PB&J, the passion, beauty, and joy of space travel. And what Tiffany said, space brings out the best in us. I wish that was all there was to it. I hate the argument made by people like Neil Tyson, because I'm afraid I have to admit it's an entirely true argument, which is that if you look back across human history, there are only 3 reasons that humanity has ever sustained campaigns, major campaigns of exploration: for the greater glory of fill in the blank, God, the king, whatever, to make money, or for a better defensive or offensive position as compared to their perceived enemies. I wish it was otherwise. I wish it was these reasons we're talking about and that I feel that are so important to me. But I think we're going to have to find, if we want to see this succeed, and I sure do, I think we're going to have to see some people able to make some money out there and maybe bring some glory back to, let's hope it's for all of humanity rather than one nation or another.
Yeah, Greg?
Yeah, Chris, what a wonderful discussion this is already. And I wanted to expand on some of Tiffany's inspiring words about this being a unifying force. And one of the things that I like to share in some of my NASA talks is that whereas 50 years ago, it was the United States and the Soviet Union that were vying with each other to be the first to the moon. Now there are dozens and dozens of countries with space programs that are actively involved in going to the moon, and as we've seen in recent weeks, going to Mars as well. And so this is already happening. And then I wanted to add a very brief scientific perspective about why we go from simply a practical reason. I'll go to a famous scientist, Steve Squires, who was the principal investigator for Spirit and Opportunity. And what he said from a simple geologist perspective, he said that what Spirit and Opportunity would accomplish in their first 90 days, which was their original mission length, is something that a good geologist could do in 15 minutes or half an hour. So having humans on the ground makes a difference.
Yep, thanks. Serena, how about you?
One thing I really love is when we talk about humanity, I mean, right now we have a great diversity of people who are engaging in space discourse, but for the first time ever, the European Space Agency is talking about bringing more people out there and having astronauts that have greater representation. When I look at space, I think of the best place where humanity comes together, regardless of your religion, your race, your politics, or any kind of division that defines who you are on Earth. And for me, that's a prime motivating factor. Matt, I love the whole topic of the politics of why we go up there. I was working with Palantir before Mission Space Food, and I totally understand, the political means, the economic means of driving us there. But if we look back at children, the first thing kids look on is the sky, space. I have a 1-year-old and he wants to be an astronaut. And we carry that hope with us as we grow older. And so it's almost human instinct, that desire to see what lays in the great beyond. And a part of that humanity is lost when we forget at the inception, we grew up looking at the sky. And for me, it's a phenomenal time to be living because we are now going along that path in a way we hadn't since the past half century.
Yeah, that's great. That's tremendous. Scott?
Yeah, I agree with all the comments that have been made so far. And, my perspective as a biologist is to think about, what is uniquely human compared to other species. And I think some of the comments that have already been made reflect the fact that exploration is part of human nature. We are innately curious. We are innately driven to go out into the unknown and to study it and try to understand it. And beyond that, I think that's actually something that, maybe not in the same way, but I think, if we look at all species on Earth, that is what life does. Life expands. Life always seeks out new opportunities. And I think in some ways our species is special, but in other ways, we are an extension of the planet that we come from. And I think we, in a way, are, Earth's opportunity to expand and seek out new worlds.
Great. Tiffany, you want to say something?
So first of all, Scott, I absolutely love that the evolutionary biologist just said life finds a way. That makes me so happy. But I wanted to point out, have you guys noticed that none of us have said we need to go into space so that we don't have all of humanity's eggs in one basket, right? So just quick show of hands for my fellow panelists. How many of you think of this as an escape route, like a way of getting enough humans off Earth so that if something bad happens to the Earth, there's still humans in the universe? Is that top of mind for anyone? I'm just looking for a show of hands.
Bottom of mind.
Yeah,
maybe in 1,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I feel like just the math wise, we can't launch enough people fast enough for that to really be our saving grace. And I'm confident we are going to be talking about Seven Eves and science fiction at some point in this conversation. Yeah. So I'll just bookmark that there. Shireen, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, it actually reminded me, Jonathan Trent, who you may know, Greg, he was from NASA and a researcher, and he talks about what happens to the human body when you go out into space. And it is no easy feat. I mean, Chris was talking about the fact that when they had sent worms up there, they came back and the worms had given birth and they had two heads coming out of their bodies. It's insane. So for us to imagine that, we can just launch out into space and that's like humanity's next savior, I think that is pushing the realms of science fiction. I believe this is something we should definitely do to explore the great beyond, but we shouldn't use it as a recourse of, oh, we muck things up here, so perhaps going into space is the next escape to create a better existence.
Yeah, good point. We're going to get that second. Let me bring up, before we go on to our next, our first poll. So we want to we're interested in what you think about how close are we? How many years do you think it will be before humans actually successfully land on Mars? And if you'd let us know your answer, we've got 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, or 20 years or more.
Heavy sigh because I pushed it out there farther than I like.
I pushed mine nearer just to be provocative.
Yeah.
So it looks like just about we're just close to 100% people have voted. Looks like 10 to 15 years seems to be the consensus. Not very many people, only 8%, 3 to 5 years, 28%, 5 to 10. And then we've got, even with more people voting, 10 to 15 years, which is kind of interesting, which is what I've actually have thought in my mind that's probably a reasonable time frame. All right, so thank everybody for participating in that. So following up on what Shireen said, and we've talked about compelling reasons, I think one of the big questions facing us as a species in moving into deep space, and I think we, when we talk about deep space, we really do incorporate the moon to some degree, but that's really not deep space. I mean, the moon's 3 days away, and I always tell people we can send frozen pizzas up there in 3 days. And of course, low Earth orbit is different. But when you're talking about deep space, when you're talking about going to Mars, and you're talking about people spending 6-7 months en route and then being on the planet, and then 6-7 months coming back, this is something that's truly, even on a scout mission, even before we talk about settling Mars, this is truly an extraordinary challenge for us as humans. And following up on what Shireen brought up, I'd like to pose the question, to everybody listening into the panel, are we built for this? And when we say built, I don't mean just physically. Physically is part of it, but as human beings, something like Dean said, are we built in all the various aspects of life for traveling and actually surviving and thriving in deep space.
So Chris, I suppose I could start out with that. The really big thing is we don't know. There are interventions that we can do, such as artificial gravity, radiation shielding, et cetera. Those drive up mission costs. I think that one of the important things that I always think about is that we need to incorporate the human mind and human psychology into this as well. And a perspective that I like to share is for almost the entire journey, you're going to be, when you're going to Mars, you're going to be seeing a gradually dimming blue dot and a gradually brightening red dot, and you're going to have no sense of motion whatsoever. And so it's going to be a bit like one of those old isolation tanks. I'm not sure what that's going to do, and whether we're built for that. But I know that we need to pay attention to it.
Tiffany,
the early pioneers who did things like cross oceans in order to colonize a new place, they would have had the same sensation, right? You would have seen the cliffs of Dover receding, and then blue, 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 and then finally something new coming up. And I'm not saying it was awesome for them, right? But like, they made it. Some of them did anyway. So I think that's a really, I'm interested in, I know Savannah and I have talked about this, like, where can we look in the past to see what people did well, and then what we could do better on. Like, for example, again, this whole crossing to the new world idea, maybe when we get to Mars, if there's life there, we could not infect it with terrible diseases and wipe it out and exploit the new planet. Like, I'll vote for that. Maybe some of my panelists feel the same.
Before I go on, let me just make a quick comment. I think we're dealing with, as Greg kind of alluded to, I think this is completely unprecedented for humans. I mean, since the beginning of time, since life began to squirm around here, 3.8 billion years ago, it's all evolved. A lot of things have changed, right? Geography, different life, climate, all those kinds of things. We've had floods, et cetera. But the two things that have been constant ever since life began in its microbial form up to where we are now is, one, we've all evolved within the context in connection to nature. So, Greg's pointing out, I think this idea of being in a spaceship is really interesting. And when you're going across the ocean, there's a similarity, but you're still within nature. And people have said to me, well, it's like people being in prison. No, they can look out the window and there's trees. I'm talking about complete, total separation and isolation from nature. And of course, the second thing is we've all evolved under 1G. And the idea of extended periods of time, I think those two things present a real question when we talk about being built. Serena, you wanted to?
Yeah, astronauts talk a lot about the overview effect and being able to look at Earth when they're on the ISS, and what a phenomenal experience that is. But when you're moving so far away and you have no reference point to Earth because you don't see it anymore, the question is, what does that do to the psychology, the mental well-being? And right now, there's a lot of focus on the science and the survival of humanity, but we're all about humanity in deep space when it comes to the art, the feeling, the nostalgia, the connections that naturally evolve when you're on Earth. How can you bring that with you? So for me, it's about food. But if we look at all pioneers who've traveled, they brought with them that piece of home, which they then gradually evolve into in their new home. So that's one thing that I want to ask. What is it that humanity should take with them when they're going further and further away from anything they've ever felt before?
Matt?
I want to go back to your comment about, how we've all evolved at the bottom of this big gravity well. I think it's nearly a crime that there hasn't been more research on how well we do in low G or microgravity environments. Of course, there's been some great work on the ISS, but really long-term efforts. And why haven't there been some tethered spacecraft with humans or other living things in them to let us know how we would do? I have faith, life finds a way, humans find a way. I think we will do it. And I think we're getting the tools that will enable us to become a spacefaring and a space occupying species. But we have so far to go. And I wish there was more research in this direction, even more than there is.
Tiffany, let me talk. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Savannah, go ahead.
I do think, however, that there is actually a lot of existing research that is not often connotated with space, but that is on isolation and extreme environments. For instance, psychoanalysis of soldiers who were on submarines, or prisoners in solitary confinement, or we see analog environments that did not go well, such as Biosphere 2. And I'm not talking to the technical issues that went to, I'm talking to the psychological breakdown that happened to both the first and second crew of Biosphere 2 because of their relation to food and because of their relation to each other. So we do have research that this is going to be difficult, essentially. And as pessimistic as it feels sometimes when I'm doing this research on isolation, extreme environments, I think one way of overcoming this is not thinking so much about what we should bring from Earth to make Mars more Earth-like. I think it's about how we will need to change as both people and as humans to be able to adapt into new environments, let go of all those ideals and all those belief systems we had on Earth and relating to infrastructure, and create new infrastructures on these extraterrestrial bodies that we're going to live on. Adapt into them instead of forcing them to adapt to us, you know?
Tiffany, let me ask you, being your biology background and your interest in space, and actually Tiffany's also been a part of one of these Mars simulation missions, which is also quite interesting. We'll get to that a little bit later. But what are some of the physics, and Greg might ask, what are some of the really, what do we know physically right now? What happens to the human body, just in the experience so far?
So we know that there are things that change based on the loss of gravity, the increase in radiation, and some of these other things. So just some really basic examples. Your fluid doesn't settle in your body the same way that it used to. Your bones lose density, you lose muscle mass because you don't have to fight gravity anymore in order to move things. Your eyes change shape because, again, the gravity is not there, so you end up having your vision changed. And then with radiation, you're taking way more radiation than you would down on Earth. So what does that do? And Matt was talking about not having a lot of data for certain things. Like, yeah, we don't know what this does to your cancer risk. We do have some really cool, so the fact that there were twins in NASA has set up a couple of cool twin studies where you can say, okay, if one of them goes to space and one of them stays on Earth, what happens to their RNA? What happens to their proteins? What happens to these various things? So there's a lot that we know that sucks but doesn't kill you. Let me put it that way.
Right.
So we know
is that your scientific?
that is my
Yeah, okay.
highly technical assessment of what's going on.
I got to write that down. Okay.
Right, sucks but doesn't kill you. But there's an important part here, right? Because if we think about when we're moving into these new environments, right? You've got explorers, you've got pioneers, and you've got settlers. Explorers, and to some extent pioneers, like, you can just kind of deal with it, right? When I was on those Mars missions, there was a lot of things that weren't great, but we dealt with it because we were doing this really amazing thing. And the longer you have to deal with it, the more that grinds on you. But if we're not just talking about it there and back, if we're actually talking about establishing civilizations, then I think what Shireen said is right. It's not just about getting through it, it's about actually thriving. And so our biology is non-consequential in that sort of long-term phase. If somebody is born on Mars and they've never experienced full Earth gravity, what happens to them when they come back? We have literally no idea. Now, I'm not going to say that means don't do anything, because I don't believe in that and I'm an experimentalist, but it means we've got to be cognizant of thinking about not just what are the limits of the human body, but what are the things we can do with technology to augment that. Someone in the Q&A mentioned CRISPR. Yeah, that's a whole thing that we can look at. How do we use robotics? How do we use AI? Just this week, there was a great article in The Economist about what pandemic isolation is doing to us when we're deprived of a sense of touch, of being touched by other human beings. And, Chris, I was thinking about this morning. I thought to myself, what is the one reason that I would say no to going to Mars? And the only reason I could come up with is if somebody told me I would never touch my son again. Yeah. That might be the only thing that kept me from going.
Before we get to, I'm going to ask Scott his thought on this. Also, another question, we'll get into is, which also brings up, do we need to, I know some people have talked about genetic engineering. Do we need to genetically engineer people? I know we've had some conversations with people at the Personal and Space Genetics Lab at Harvard Medical School about that. And we're going to be exploring that in a subsequent webinar as well, but that gets into it. Scott, you thought a lot about evolution and how we're going to evolve as people. What's your sense?
Yeah, well, I wanted to actually chime in on the previous question first, if I can, which, I think people have brought up some really important points and open questions, right? And I wanted to add a couple of additional questions to those that have already been raised. And these are kind of specific things that we really just don't know that much about, that I think are major potential limiting factors. And one of those, Chris, you were talking about our connection with nature. One of the things that we've really learned a lot about in the last few decades is the role of microorganisms and the roles that they play in and on the human body, what we call the microbiome. We actually cannot live without the microorganisms that live in and on our human bodies. And we get those microorganisms from interactions with other people and from the environment to a certain extent. We don't know what will happen to us if we move away from Earth and move away from the source of those microorganisms and get to a situation where we can no longer continue to acquire them. I think that's one really important thing that we need to understand. There was some studies of this in the twin study that was brought up earlier, but we're tip of the iceberg on that. And the other thing that was an important point that was brought up is the idea of reproduction, raising children, childbirth. We know very little about what limiting factors there might be if we try to start having children in a lower gravity, higher radiation environment. We don't know about fertilization, we don't know about pregnancy, we don't know about childbirth, and we don't know about child development. So there's a lot of important research that needs to happen in all of those areas before we can really responsibly and realistically think about having multi-generational settlements. But all of those relate to your question about evolution. So I don't want to go on too long here. I could talk a long time about this, but all of those have to do with evolution, because evolution is about survival and, more importantly, reproduction. So with each new generation that we have in a new place like Mars, we're going to be looking at evolutionary changes.
Yeah, and Matt, before you start, you raise a good point, because if we can't safely reproduce in that environment, that really puts a pretty big matzo ball in the place of settling Mars or other planets. Go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say, Scott, because of your talk about the microbiome and its importance, want to read a great book about the challenges of humanity moving into space. It's the great Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, about a colony ship trying to make it to a nearby star and the challenges they face. And a lot of it is based on biology. He took a lot of heat from a lot of his science fiction author colleagues for this, but he really does a good job of talking about the challenges that will be faced, even with very advanced technology. And it doesn't go well. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Serena?
Yeah, I love that you talk about, reproducing, because one of the core elements of reproducing is also nutrition. What will babies eat? Will they be able to drink breast milk? How does that work? And so, Savannah, when you were referencing the interactions between people and food being such an inherent part of that, when it comes to crews, we always hear about how it's about the meal that they share. It's about having a tense day, and then it's breaking that tension over food. And so for me, a large part of us thriving in space is, how do you break it down to those minute interactions you're going to be having with your crew in isolation for years on end? And what does that mean? So for me, it means, what are you eating? How do you please your soul? Not just in terms of the nutrition you take in, but what actually makes you happy and joyful to continue living in such inhospitable environments. And that's what it really comes down to when it comes to humanity thriving in a place where they've never stretched before.
Right. Greg?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something here about reproduction. And so I was payload manager for Space Lab J for 2 of the big experiments there. And one of them actually dealt with that. And to my knowledge, it's the only one that ever has in space. And so we used the African clawed frog because it's so well understood genetically. And and there are certain stages in development of embryos that we looked at, both in a 1G control and 0G. What we found is that there was a lot of plasticity in the creatures, and so tadpoles that were hatched in microgravity actually grew up to be frogs and were donated to museums later. However, there were some notable changes in early stages of development. And so would I want to have kids in 0G without knowing more about this? I don't think so. I think we need to study that a lot more first.
Yeah, Dane, I want to ask you, we talk about, Serena talked about, and others have talked about the importance of, the humanities, the arts, and the evolution of humans and history. How do we do that, in your sense, in a real way, other than just saying, oh, we need to write poetry while we're going to Mars? I mean, how do we actually, instill that in a very kind of large way, overarching way?
I was actually thinking about the interesting tension between what Shireen and Savannah were talking about earlier, this desire on one hand to import as much as we can from our current culture to sort of make us feel at home where we're going, but then also the desire to sort of make our lives and our humanity where we're going to be. And I was thinking about how, even what it means to thrive, and what it means to thrive is in some ways to listen to the stories we tell ourselves, about our own happiness, or what it means to even mean as a human being, and how we might want elements of our current lives on Earth, wherever we're going to be. If you've ever lived in a different country for any period of time, you always find yourself eating the food where you are, listening to the bands where you are, reading books by people who are there. So what we're going to do is we're going to want like musicians making music who are there. We're going to want people on that planet writing about being on that planet, always sort of piping in a kind of discourse of nostalgia. I think will always create the sense of un-at-homeness. So what we're going to need is diverse representation of the humanities to connect our internal worlds with this external world. And that's really what's going to make it feel at home. It's when you sort of feel like you're alive and living in a place, not just working in a place. And who knows what that will look like. You may not want poets. You may want filmmakers, right? You may want chefs. And you're going to want, I do think you're going to want people writing about the experience of living there beyond simple reportage or journalism. You're going to want someone sort of connecting the life of a place with what it means for the human beings who are trying to make sense of being there.
Okay. Savannah, you want to say something?
Yeah, and this was actually something I wanted to comment in relation to this and what Shireen said at the very beginning of the seminar about inclusivity and about exploration. What Matt was saying, a lot of our history of exploration in the world has been fueled by imperialism. And I do think, as Greg said, let's just connect it all, that the commercialization of space is one route to help mitigate that imperialism, because space is being democratized, is being made available to more people. And how we interact with happiness, with food, is very unique to our culture, important to all cultures, but uniquely treated. So how individuals in Bali interact with a family meal is completely different how we do in America. And so I think the more diverse population we have in our settlement, the more we'll be able to learn from each other about, what we have in common as a species inherently, and what we bring from our own cultures. And I do think, I'll stop there because there's.
Well, I want to go back. Yeah, I want to go back and I want to talk, just circle back, because I think it's an example of the problem we face. Go back to food for a second. We talk about that, but think about the problem. First of all, if you go to Mars, Greg, you can't, when you go deep, you can't take very much with you. I guess you could have Greg, I don't know if NASA's ever talked about a supply ship going up at the same time, but you can't take anything with you. So when you think of food as an example, The question becomes, if you can't take anything with you, and food is such an integral part of our lives, our history, and our evolution, socially, culturally, what are we going to eat? You talked about Savannah. It's true. I mean, people in Egypt, people in Somalia are eating different things than people in New York or California, et cetera. And so it's not like we can say, well, we just take, fake hamburger meat because everybody doesn't, that's not the truth. So how do we deal with that really hard problem of producing? How are we going to produce this food? And what is it we're going to produce?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start out by saying this is actually something that NASA is thinking about quite a bit. And the first step is something that we call in situ in situ resource utilization, ISRU. That's something that my institute is pretty heavily focused on. And the idea is we now know, for instance, with the moon, that there's a lot of water there. We didn't think so even a dozen years ago, but we know that there is now. We know the same thing for Mars, and we're starting to learn about other minerals that are going to be useful. And so step one is finding out where those are, which we're doing right now, and then finding out how to harvest them and how to bring them into our sphere so that we can develop things. We know we're going to need to grow plants and synthesize foods in various different ways. How we're going to do that is as yet unknown.
Yeah, Tiffany, how about synthetic biology? What role I think is that going to play in all of this?
Man, I've been sitting here ready to pop. Yes, I think there's a lot of really exciting food tech stuff that's happening right now. So cellular agriculture. Frankly, I don't want cows or fish on my spaceship while I'm going to Mars, but I would like to be able to have some poke or a burger when I get there. And so cellular agriculture is this new way of making food products, specifically meat or fish products, so protein, that you start with the stem cells or other cellular sources from the animal, but then from there you're basically growing it in the lab and making food out of it. And not science fiction. There's lots of this stuff in the news. In fact, just last week or the week before, Aleph Farms announced that they had 3D printed their first steak. So we're moving in this direction. And again, as someone who's been on 3 simulations, I cannot underemphasize how important the food is. I was talking to a New York Times reporter on my first thing, and he was like, well, how do you feel about going to Mars? And I had already been there for a while. And I was like, if there's not cheese, I'm not going. And I said it like off the cuff, but then I realized I kind of meant it. I was tired of living on food that was keeping us alive, but wasn't nourishing. And even with some of the food we had was rather poor quality. And, we all lost weight while we were on these missions, but we still managed to build rituals around the food that we did have. So for example, if we had not had powdered hot chocolate, I don't know what we would have done, because every day we had these hot chocolate routines that included poetry. We would do a haiku poetry slam while we were drinking our hot chocolate. The folks who would just come in from EVA, everybody was always cold and sweaty and banged up. You just felt like crap. If somebody put a mug of hot chocolate in your hand and you could smell it and you could feel that warmth, that was a big deal. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to have hot beverages in space, right? How are we going to get the food that we both like, but then have room to innovate? I think we've got a lot of tech support that's coming our way with this in just the next even 2 years. Shireen, what do you think? What am I missing?
I'm bursting to speak on this one. I'm so excited we're actually talking about this. I'm going to approach it from 2 different angles. One is looking at the multisensory pleasure of food. So you talk about smell. A lot of times astronauts don't have the ability to smell things as acutely, and 80% of what we perceive as flavor is actually the olfactory sensation. So NASA talks about growing plants, but you really have to remember, what is it that imbues flavor in food? I was born in Bangladesh, but most of my childhood was in Norway. When my mom first moved to Norway in the early 80s, there were no spices, and she had no idea what to do for flavor. It would kill her soul. And so she'd go back to Bangladesh and bring back spices. So I think the idea of not just having plants, but having a way of creating flavor that overcomes the fact that you can't smell and taste things that are very subtle. So when we talk about cellular biology, fake meats, they put so much sodium in it to make it tasty. But what are other nuanced ways of doing this, which is why we're really lucky because we have Michelin star chefs on our team creating the food. But the other component I don't want to lose sight of is the nutritional degradation. You can take food up with you, but the nutrients will degrade over time. And how do you overcome that so you pair both the micronutrient deficiency with the desire to have flavor? And that to me is really the core of what we need to focus on when it comes to survivability, because yes, there are a lot of other impediments, but just for your body to survive, it needs to be given more than just, here are some plants, here's some fake meat, eat it. You have to desire that to continue.
Savannah?
Yeah, to draw on that on nutritional value and Matt's reference of Aurora, which is also one of my favorite sci-fi books. And let's bring in The Martian by Andy Weir as well. And The Biosphere Experiment again, which was so unique because it was truly self-contained. The oxygen was contained. They grew their own food for 2 years. And what all three of those have in common is how important caloric count became over the years, and also how psychologically their understanding of food completely changed. You see Mark Watney dealing with malnutrition, and in the real world, you saw the biosphere participants also dealing with malnutrition as they incurred blight on their crops. There was times when they would have major banana harvest and they would have to keep those bananas locked in a medical cabinet because they themselves would be so tempted to go get those bananas. And the authors of these, they're biographical accounts, you can get them on Amazon, talk about that and how it changed their perspective of food, but also how it changed their perspective of processed food. What we eat on planet Earth, in westernized countries at least, is very processed. And after exiting the biosphere and living off of grown foods, which we would probably be doing in space, they were just looking at the back of the packages like, what is in this? Like, what are all these 15 million ingredients? Like, why are they there? And it completely changed their mindset on how they interacted and ate food. But also the importance of it never went away.
Yeah, I think, Matt, I think too, what Serena just said, I think that's important. When we talk about all the different nuances here, things like smell, we take those things for granted. I mean, are we going to simulate smell on these? We'll get back to that question, but go ahead, Matt.
I think the first bestseller that will be written on Mars will be 101 Great Things You Can Do with Potatoes. There are so many considerations of food and eating and its cultural and social importance in science fiction. I don't know how many other fans of The Expanse there are out there, but you have this oppressed group, the Belters, that people from Earth and Mars call the skinnies, and they basically live on fungus and algae made material, and when they can get their hands on it, it costs a fortune. Finding a bottle of genuine scotch or a piece of meat becomes like just manna from heaven, literally almost manna from heaven. And I think it does a great job of showing how food also becomes something that separates us by class and caste. And that's also something that we're going to have to consider.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, Scott.
Yeah, I wanted to add a few other sort of thoughts to this, because, when I think about the reality of trying to grow some of these crops, I mean, I couldn't help when Tiffany was talking about the importance of hot chocolate, remembering that, the plant that chocolate comes from, cacao, has to be pollinated by tiny little flies, right? And so it's just one small example of how dependent even our agriculture is on the natural environment of Earth. And once we remove our agriculture from that environment, we can't assume that we can grow things, even if we're accounting for the differences, say, in gravity or radiation, because we're just, we're in such a different environment. But I think Tiffany also brought up the challenges of, maybe not having livestock, right, to have meat. I think there's basically, that would be sort of impossible to bring any sort of live animal. But there's other reasons why, even if we could, we shouldn't, right? If we could bring birds and mammals with us, even small ones that we were going to try to keep as livestock or as pets, we actually run the risk of continuing to contract diseases from them. So I talked before about the role of the microbiome, but there's also the role of infectious diseases. I mean, when they're in the middle of a pandemic now, caused by a virus that's shifted hosts from an animal to a human. And that has happened again and again throughout history, and will continue to happen again and again, as long as we surround ourselves with animals that are similar enough to us that these disease agents can switch hosts. So we actually have an opportunity if we choose not to bring birds and mammals, because those are the sources of so many of our diseases. So, rather than seeing that particular thing as a challenge, maybe we could also switch gears to see it as an opportunity to try to, escape from some of the most common sources of disease once we're no longer on Earth.
But
Serena,
then
you wanted to
would
jump
be
in?
escaping from a common source of joy too, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if you guys can hear my cat trying to rip the door down because I've locked her up because she can't sit in my lap while I'm talking to y'all. But it's interesting. I mean, Scott, you brought up this really great point about infectious disease. All these horrible things have happened, and yet we're still here after 4 billion years. So sometimes I wonder whether it's too easy to actually overthink some of these issues. I would be terrified of the idea of going to Mars and messing up the life that's already there by bringing life with us. But if, God forbid, there's nothing there, like, I kind of love the idea of, I don't know how I feel about terraforming, but having more than just humans. I mean, again, like, I'm speaking as a biologist, but also just as a person who gets so much joy out of these other living things. And so I'm wondering whether, if we think of these things happening in phases, like maybe, like you're saying, Scott, maybe those early explorers, maybe the very earliest pioneers don't take animals with them because the populations are a little too precarious, and we're able to, you could get them wiped out from an infectious disease. But looking further down the line, 100 years, 200 years, what does that actually look like? Like you said, if we can't have agriculture without pollinators, we're in a lot of trouble. Like, what's the plan? So I'm trying to make my thinking about this a little more nuanced, thinking about the biology and the technology and the psychological aspects of it.
Serena?
Really quickly, wanted to mention the question of class and food. When I think of chocolate, I think of how much joy it brings. But to this day, there is child labor, in fact, child slavery, that is very closely connected with the production of chocolate. And so when we go into space, how are we thinking about class and representation? Because it has been a part of our biology since the beginning of history when it comes to food production. And even living in California, it's all to do with class and socioeconomic disparity when it comes to producing food.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, we're going to take, I think we're going to, the same problems we have on Earth, we're going to be taking with us. And so we need to be thinking about how we overcome those, and why, I guess one reason too, while it's so important that we think seriously about these kinds of problems on Earth, because they're in a sense, they're metaphors for the kinds of things that we are going to face, and we are facing as we move into deep space. And if you look at, we talked about exploration earlier and colonization. If you look at the history of human nature when it comes to exploration and colonization, it's pretty dire. I mean, we still to this day have people being slaughtered for other people to have access to diamonds or food or other kinds of things, and so we haven't made much progress about that. And I think that gets, I want to spend a lot of time on it, but what about, we talk about are we built for this? I think, are we built for this from the standpoint of our human nature? I mean, as humans doing this right.
Well, I was going to, follow up what Tiffany said. Our conversation of chocolate made me think of it. I think, again, we're still thinking of this from a very specific Western democratized lens. And what brings us joy as who we are, living privileged lives as Americans is not what brings everyone joy. Some cultures don't even believe in having pets. As much as I love my fur babies, like, there's lots of cultures out there who do not think you should have pets.
Right.
And I wrote an article a while about on like what we can learn from Arctic peoples. And the first thing I said to my professor on Arctic studies is, I was like, you know, how do Arctic peoples deal with this harsh environment in space? And he's like, let me stop you right there, because they don't think of it as harsh. They think of it as bountiful and full of resources, but they also live on their feet. You know, they don't bring things with them that they don't need, and they find so much happiness in their lives. So I think this is like going into space is really going to require some reflexivity as we move forward. That being said, like if I was in space, I would want some little things from home, you know, those little nostalgic factors, they are important, but I think it's going to make us consider the term necessity very differently as we start to really work on colonizing Mars. And as you said, in terms of colonization, Chris, and our human nature, I mean, our history of colonization is not great. And I mentioned imperialism before. And I think that being said, I don't think we should discount the entire human race, you know, and say we shouldn't go because we're gonna be evil about it. But it would be nice to know if there was going to be a system of checks and balances, if this wasn't going to be led by capitalism. You know, someone in the questions mentioned how to balance commercializing space and capitalism. And I think it's a hard thing to do. It's something we're really going to have to consider heavily moving forward.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be, I mean, I agree, but you know, and I think again, we won't have a lot of time to deal with this, but one of the other issues dealing with deep space, you know, what, if you want to talk, you know, what rules are there going to be? Are there going to be rules? I mean, we've had certain private companies talk about, well, they're not going to be rules. We're going to go up there and, you know, we'll make the rules when we get there. And so, you know, you get back to some of this. And the question is, I think that's why we talked earlier, this is truly a planetary problem and a planetary challenge and issue. And somehow, as difficult as it may be, before we actually do this in earnest, you know, how are we going to come together as a planet to represent all these diverse needs and interests and backgrounds as a planet going to these places, and not just as my company or my country, but others. In fact, I also saw something interesting just yesterday. I think it was ESA, the European Space Agency, is now recruiting physically challenged people to go to space. And we talked about that at our event back in October of 2019, which was the first Humanity in Deep Space live event, which we had before COVID, was that when you're one of the equalizers in space is that because of the absence of gravity, people who have difficult, you know, lots of problems perhaps on Earth do not necessarily have those challenges in space. In fact, the article I read said, you know, if you don't have legs, that's probably okay. And so I thought that was an interesting take on this as well. Yeah, Serena.
I was quite curious. I think at the beginning, Greg, you may have mentioned mining, and Matt, you were talking about commercialization and what comes with it. When we look back on our history, for example, Cecil Rhodes, we'll mention him. He was the creator of blood diamonds, but we have a way of glorifying the plunderers. Everyone talks about the Rhodes Scholarship as something amazing, but it's still blood money. I'm Canadian, and we laud Peter Monk as being this great philanthropist, but he actually caused death and devastation to hundreds and hundreds of generations of Aboriginals in South America because he was mining for gold. So for us to say we'll go there and we'll build our own history and we'll make it all happen, if we look back at our history and how that's, you know, led us to where we are now, are we going to recreate this, or will we learn from it? Because when it comes to mining for these natural resources, the ramifications are vast, and they have continued throughout our very history.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, Dean.
Yeah, I just want to get back to what you asked previously about if we are built for this. And I would ask a larger question about if we're emotionally or psychologically built for this project as well. Human identity is formed in context. And so if you take a human being out of one context, we are absolutely going to change as human beings. I am right now looking out in my study at the Pacific Ocean. I think of myself as someone who lives in relation to the ocean. It sounds, I go there for all sorts of reasons. And if you are someone who skateboards or who goes on hikes, and you take all of those things that make you who you are away from you and put you somewhere else, how you think of yourself in relation to external properties is going to alter how you see the world and how you see each other. So I really wonder what's going to happen to our sense of identity and how we know who we are if the things that we articulate ourselves against are taken away from us.
Surf's up on Titan,
exactly.
Dean.
Yeah, go ahead.
Surf's up.
No, I think that's true. And I think that, again, you know, a lot of the nuances that we're talking about, they're going to play a role in this humanity. We talk about the arts, design, right? I mean, design, the design of the ship that's going to take us there. When we get there, you know, what all these issues and how important design is to humans and things like food, et cetera, et cetera. We're getting ready to go into the Q&A question, but before we do that, I want to just get back to one thing and then we'll go into this. Something that Tiffany brought up, which I think is an important issue. And let me also point out to the audience, I know we're going through a lot of this stuff very quickly. But the plan is this is kind of an overview opening webinar, and we do plan on addressing in subsequent webinars, probably maybe every 6 weeks or so, on these more specific topics. So we will have a webinar just talking about food. We'll just have probably a webinar, simply talking physically about physiology, genetics, genetic engineering, all those kinds of things. So we will have various topics on these various other kinds of issues that we will delve into. But the one issue is, I think is an interesting one, and it's kind of existential and somewhat controversial. But what obligation do we have as humans, as a civilization, if in fact we go to Mars and we drill down 50 meters or so and we find life? I mean, what obligation, and I know it's a little bit of navel gazing, but what obligation do we have to the universe or how do we try to make sure we don't interrupt that life cycle? Or is that important? Maybe it's not important. Maybe we're humans and we're king of the universe and we just do what we want.
This is why NASA has a planetary protection officer. I think it's absolutely vital, if only for selfish reasons, because of what we might learn from those living organisms and whether we're related to them. I think and then just the moral question as well. It would be so sad if we went there and, Earth organisms wiped out the last living Martians.
Right. I completely agree, Matt. I mean, this is something that I have struggled with. I was one of the people that was fortunate enough to start astrobiology about 25 or so years ago, and the question is that we haven't answered as an agency is at what point do we say Mars doesn't have life? Could it always exist in some little pocket, 300 meters beneath the surface that we haven't yet explored? And I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
And there's cross-contamination. We could kill an entire ecosystem, an entire planetary ecosystem, or it could be an Andromeda strain situation, depending on whether it's DNA-based life or what. It's something that we need to think about very seriously.
Let me go down to some of the questions that have been, we've had lots of questions, almost 60. And obviously you try to do service to those. One of the early questions was about the economics of all this. Matt alluded to that earlier, and who's going to pay for this? If we talk about purely a commercial venture, or largely, and maybe the relationship between the public sector and the private sector. I think if you've just seen that SpaceX, Axiom Space and SpaceX have just come up with a private crew, and I think it's $55 million per astronaut or something. So it's obviously, this is not an inexpensive endeavor.
I think this is really a question. I think I'll tie this back to where we briefly mentioned governance. Whether these space ventures are paid for by commercial space companies or governments or a collaborative effort, the people sponsoring these ventures are really the ones who are going to have power over how things are governed, and they will be who sets the rules and the guides. So on a personal level, I would love to see going forward a collaborative effort in colonizing space instead of one person or one company or one government having a monopoly over it, because the more collaboration we have, the more voices we'll have in governing space. You know, I get asked a lot, oh, if we have a Martian colony, like what kind of government will it have? Will it be democracy? Will it be like, you know, will there be a captain of the crew who gets the final say? And I think it's going to be none of those things. It's not going to be up to the decisions of the colonizers. It's going to be up to the decisions of those who are running it. The Martian is a fun example of that, where we see Mark Watney stranded on Mars, radio silent for almost like a year and a half. And then NASA comes on and is like, hey, you need to do this, this, and this. And Mark Watney is like, hell no, absolutely not. Like, you guys abandoned me. Like, I'm going to do what I think is best in this situation. So I would like to see collaborative investors in space working on the same project together, sharing the resources, and making those resources accessible to multiple scientific and technological organizations.
One of the questions was talking about being built for this physically, psychologically connection to nature. What role do you see virtual reality, artificial reality, perhaps playing as we go forward?
Well, I think it's going to make a big thing for psychological health, right?
Yeah.
If you are able to immerse yourself in an environment, particularly if you've got haptic, maybe you even have olfactory stimuli. Again, thinking again in terms of explorers, pioneers, settlers, you know, especially at the beginning when you really are going to be leaving everything behind just to get boots on the ground on Mars. I think VR is going to be really important just for keeping people sane. I remember how it felt after 6 weeks of not having felt the wind on my face, because every time I stepped outside our habitat, I was wearing a bubble. You know, I felt like I was going to lose my mind. I felt like if I couldn't smell grass, there was just all this deprivation. And so I think VR has a lot of potential to undo a lot of that sensory deprivation, maybe not make it the same as it is on Earth, but at least make it bearable so that you can get through these early phases until you've got more stimuli and touch points in place.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Greg, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Tiffany, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And NASA is actually making some significant investments in this. My institute is making some significant investments. And so, you know, first of all, for augmented reality as a tool to help us explore, we have ideas where astronauts in the field would have smart tools to enable them to choose all of the various rocks, like Dave Scott chose the Genesis rock, for instance, on Apollo 15. And virtual reality, we have several of our teams that are working on it. There's some big efforts at JPL and JSC in Houston. So yes, it is going to be a very, very important thing, and it already is actually.
Yeah, Matt.
I think of, you know, my wife and I go to Mars and we have kids, assuming that that's even biologically possible. Are we going to restrict their time in the holodeck where they, you know, get to walk around in a forest, something that they will probably never be able to do? And what are they going to think of us when they have that experience and say, you gave birth to us here, we can never go back home to that blue marble, you know, the pale blue dot? I would hope that, you know, that kind of experience, virtual reality experience, the more sophisticated, the better, is something that everybody could take advantage of. But there will be the psychological ramifications of it being available.
Yeah, before I get to Serena, one thing I want to ask Scott. One of the questions was, Scott, from your perspective, you know, once we actually settle Mars and people are up there, the question was, would they ever be able to really come back and live on Earth?
I think it's a super important question, and the short answer from my perspective is we don't know. I think there's a couple of reasons why we should take seriously the idea that they might not be able to, especially once we start talking about multiple generations, right? People that are born in a different gravity environment, their bodies will likely, we think, probably develop very differently. And that includes things like potentially having weaker bones, having a weaker heart that might not be able to support the gravity of Earth. I mean, that shows up in science fiction quite a bit, right? That idea. But then there's also, to go back, I keep talking about microorganisms, but they're so important, right? And disease. And so if people grow up in environments where they're not exposed to very many infectious disease agents, or perhaps almost none, what happens to their immune systems? Do they atrophy? Do they begin to basically not have a functional immune system, or at the very least not be effective at combating earth microbes? So it could actually be very dangerous for people to come back and interact with the microorganisms on Earth. So I think we don't know, but there's a lot of reasons why we should be concerned about that possibility.
Serena?
No, I'm really happy you mentioned that, Scott. So what I was going to say is COVID is an interesting scenario for us where we're spending so much time on screens. And I usually love meeting people and interacting, but then you have like screen fatigue, especially with younger kids. Like, do you have them sit in front of a screen for 9 to 12 hours a day? They have their entertainment, their education, their talks with their grandparents. And so what does that do to our biology if the way we even interact and learn and appreciate the experiences around us has to do with augmented reality and a screen? So whether that impairs, our psychological ability, our visual ability, and what's the long-term ramification of that kind of stimuli?
Yeah. One of the quick comments I want to make too is that we talk about the metaphors for Earth. I was just got through reading a new book called Extraterrestrial, which is a really interesting book. And one of the things that the author points out, which is really important, he said, I think it's Dr. Loeb from Harvard. Did I pronounce that right, Tiffany? Is that yeah? And so I recommend it, but he said, one of the key things as to whether we're going to be successful at deep space exploration as a species is that do we survive long enough on Earth to actually have to accomplish this? And I won't get into it, but there's this thing called the big sift that people talk about, where things happen to civilizations that perhaps prevent them from evolving to the point. So just talking about all the problems, talking about, well, what's the reality today? It's really important that we take care of ourselves here and our planet, because we're going to need a lot of time in order to do this successfully. And if we're not around to do that, then that's going to be a problem in and of itself. We're just about out of time. I want to thank everybody. It's been a great conversation. Anybody that would like to make a comment, they can go to the Humanity and Deep Space website homepage, and there's a contact list on there, and you can leave a comment. And I also I'm going to come back for a second, but I also want to put up one more poll at the end here for everybody to respond to after the conversation, number 3. And if you would respond for this, and we'll see what you think after this discussion. So the question is, if you were offered a round trip ticket, but with no guarantee of return to Mars today, how would you respond?
Space Tango actually making this offer, because I'll get in line.
Okay. Okay, let's see. We've got interesting. 22% said, yeah, I'm ready to go. 21% said, are you crazy? So we had 22% on that, 25% on interesting, but I have a few questions, 32% on check back with me in a few years, and then 21% are you crazy? So yeah, that's really interesting. That's a fun poll, and that kind of gives us some sense about the conversation. So having said that, does anybody have a final thing they want to say before we sign off here? Anything?
Thank you so much for bringing us together, Chris.
It's been fun. Like I said, we'll be following up with specific webinars on very specific topics. And so you'll see a lot of these people again. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time. I know everybody's busy, and for all of our friends in other countries who are on very different time zones who also took this time. We are recording this, so this will be available on our YouTube channel, the Humanity and Deep Space YouTube channel as well. So thank all the panelists, thank everybody for watching, and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.